He drove with the quiet grace of a man who had nothing to prove. But when the blue lights flared behind him, Clarence Whitaker, Georgia's 68-year-old Chief Justice, knew this stop wasn't about a traffic violation. He kept his hands visible, his voice calm. No anger, no panic, just one sentence. "Call your supervisor. Tell them who I am." The young officer smirked, until the radio answered back with urgency. Backup swarmed, cuffs clicked shut, but the damage was already done. Tonight, a war began with silence. But how far would it go? Comment below where you're watching from. And if you believe dignity should never be mistaken for guilt, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because justice is just getting started. The sun dipped low behind the Georgia pines, casting amber light across the winding streets of Eastwood Heights, a neighborhood where manicured lawns and trimmed hedges painted a portrait of peace. But inside the dark blue Lexus easing down Cypress Lane, a different kind of presence stirred. Clarence Whitaker was heading home. At 68, Clarence carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had lived 100 battles and won most of them with nothing but intellect, restraint, and the weight of his name. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin weathered by years of facing resistance, wrapped in suits and smiles. His hair was a silver crown, his jaw firm beneath a neatly trimmed beard. On this drive, he wore a crisp white shirt, navy tie loosened just enough to breathe, and a charcoal blazer that still bore a faint crease from a long day at a judicial ethics conference in Atlanta. To most, he looked like someone important, but to the wrong eyes in the wrong uniform, he looked like a problem. He was less than 15 minutes from his driveway when the flashing lights appeared behind him. No siren, no warning, just authority, suddenly without cause. Clarence checked his speed. He was under the limit. He hadn't rolled through any stops. This was a clean drive. Still, he slowed, calmly, pulled to the curb and parked in front of a quiet row of homes. His movements were practiced, hands on the wheel, window halfway down, body still. The officer approached, early 20s, white buzz cut. One hand rested near his holster. The other gripped a flashlight, even though daylight still painted the street in gold. Clarence spoke first, polite but firm. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer didn't answer. His eyes flicked across the interior of the Lexus, lingering for a second too long on Clarence's face, then the briefcase on the passenger seat. Suspicion crept into his gaze. Cold, mechanical, and rehearsed, license and registration. Clarence nodded. "Of course. My ID is in my inner jacket pocket. I'll reach for it slowly." The officer gave a short nod, but his stance shifted. Clarence moved slowly, deliberately, and handed over the documents. Still no explanation. Clarence tried again, calmly. "Was there a problem with my driving?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back and pressed the button on his radio. "Dispatch. This is Unit 214. I've got a black male approximately 60 to 70 years old driving a Lexus, requesting backup at my location. Possible suspicious situation." Suspicious. The word hit the air like a trigger. Clarence sat frozen, jaw clenched behind decades of experience. There was no reason for this. No warrant. No warning. Just a gut decision made by a boy with a badge and a bias. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime stirred in the breeze. A dog barked behind a fence. And Clarence, Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, veteran civil rights advocate, decorated legal mind, sat quietly framed in a false narrative he'd spent his life trying to dismantle. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped without cause. But something about this one felt different. The tension wasn't just in the officer's voice. It was in the silence, the waiting, the backup call for a man sitting calmly with his hands in plain view. Clarence didn't move, didn't speak. But something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never should have happened. But it had. And he knew the moment that second cruiser arrived, this would no longer be a misunderstanding. It would be a test. The second cruiser arrived with the hush of inevitability. No sirens, just presence. A quiet threat dressed in blue pulling up behind Clarence's Lexus as the last sliver of sunlight slipped behind the rooftops. The evening turned cooler. Still, from the new vehicle stepped an older white officer, stocky, seasoned, jaw tight, like he'd seen too much or not enough of the right things. His eyes met the younger cop's with a nod. No words exchanged, just an unspoken understanding that whatever story had been told over the radio would now be acted out with twice the certainty. Clarence stayed still. The older officer approached on the driver's side. The younger one now stood by the passenger door, hand still near his holster. "Step out of the car, sir," the older officer said flatly. Clarence kept his voice level. "Officers, I provided my ID. I'm Chief Justice Clarence Whitaker of the Georgia Supreme Court. I've just returned from a judicial conference. There's been some mistake. The name should have meant something, but it didn't." The younger officer sneered. "Yeah, and I'm the mayor of Atlanta." Clarence slowly reached into his inner pocket again. He produced a slim leather wallet and unfolded it, revealing not only his driver's license, but his official court-issued ID and state bar membership card, complete with his photo and embossed seal. He extended it toward the older officer. The man took it, barely glanced, then he scoffed. "This looks fake." Clarence blinked. "It's not. You can call the chief administrator's office. The number's on the back," I said. Out of the car, the older cop's snapped voice rising half a pitch. Clarence exhaled slowly. He had spent decades teaching young lawyers the importance of staying calm in the presence of provocation. Now he lived it breath by breath. His fingers trembled faintly as he undid the seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, both officers closed in. Hands on the hood, he complied. The pat-down was rough, purposeful. The younger officer dug his fingers into the folds of Clarence's blazer, yanked the fabric back, searched with a force that suggested danger, except there was none. Clarence didn't resist. He'd spent a lifetime walking a line thinner than most men could see, and tonight the tightrope had narrowed even more. "You carrying anything illegal?" the young officer asked. "No," Clarence replied, jaw set. "And you have no probable cause." That earned him a harder shove. The older officer grunted. Smart mouth for a fake judge. And there it was, that fragile line between disbelief and willful denial. Clarence stared forward, eyes fixed on the windshield of his car. He could see his own reflection, creased, composed, tired. He didn't feel fear. Not exactly. He felt the same bone-deep weariness he had carried since his first courtroom, since the first time someone called him boy in a three-piece suit. He thought of the Constitution he'd sworn to uphold, the lectures he gave to first-year law students about justice, about dignity, about restraint, and he wondered for a moment if any of it had ever mattered outside the classroom. His ID was real, his status was real, but in this moment none of it shielded him. In their eyes he was a black man, in a nice car, in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. And that was enough. The pat-down ended, no weapons, no threat, but still they didn't back away. Instead, the older officer circled to the trunk. "Pop it." Clarence hesitated. "There's no cause." I said, "Pop it." Something inside him broke quietly. Not from fear, but from the ache of knowing that no matter how many titles he held, he was still treated like a suspect in his own country. He reached into the car and opened the trunk. They would find nothing. They never would. But that wasn't the point. From across the quiet suburban street, a curtain twitched. Mrs. Patel, the elderly widow in the beige house with the rose bushes, had been watching through her living room window when the second police cruiser arrived. She'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, and she knew Clarence Whitaker. She knew his face, his kindness, his rhythm. She also knew that something about this wasn't right. She reached for her phone and started recording. On the curb, Clarence stood motionless as the officers poked through his trunk. A few folders neatly stacked. A pair of dress shoes, a garment bag from the conference. Nothing else. "Turn around," the younger officer said. Clarence hesitated. "You've searched me. You've searched the vehicle. You've found nothing. I've given you my identification and I've told you who I am. You are making a serious..." The older officer grabbed his arm, twisted it. "Turn around." Click. The first cuff snapped into place around his left wrist. Then the second. A black man, in cuffs. On his own street, Clarence was spun around and marched toward the waiting cruiser like a criminal paraded for effect. He didn't resist. His spine stayed straight, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the horizon like he'd done for decades, from courtroom galleries to hostile meetings. But there was no courtroom here, just asphalt and laughter. "Man, he talks real educated for a perp." The younger officer chuckled, the other grinned. Maybe he watched one too many Law and Order reruns. Clarence said nothing. Not when they patted him down again before stuffing him into the back seat. Not when they slammed the door behind him like he was a danger to someone. Not even when one of them mumbled, "Can't wait to see his face when he realizes jail food ain't catered." Inside the patrol car, the air was stifling. No breeze, no dignity, just the tight grip of steel around his wrists and the echo of his own silence. Clarence looked down. His cufflinks were gone, probably in the street where they'd yanked his arms behind his back. They had been a gift from his late wife, ivory and gold, with his initials engraved on the back. He blinked once and let that pain pass without letting it take root. Across the street, Mrs. Patel kept recording. She caught the image of a 68-year-old black man in a tailored gray suit seated in the back of a police cruiser, hands cuffed, eyes forward, lips pressed tight. Not defiant, not fearful, just steady. The image would go viral later, but for now it lived only in her camera and in her conscience. The officers stood outside the car talking low and laughing. One of them mimicked Clarence's voice. "Excuse me, officers, I'm a judge," he said in a poor imitation complete with a mock bow. The other shook his head. "Bet he teaches fake law at some community college." They still hadn't radioed in a charge. They still hadn't read him his rights. Because this wasn't about procedure, it was about power. Clarence stared through the barrier between the front and back seats, watching his own reflection in the glass. What would his former students say if they saw this? What would the clerks who looked up to him think? But this wasn't about shame. Shame belonged to them. What Clarence held on to was something deeper than dignity. It was discipline forged through years of knowing when silence was the sharpest blade. Let them laugh. Let them fumble for reasons to justify what they'd already done. He would not give them more than what they'd already stolen, because this moment was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The steel door groaned open and Clarence was led into the booking area, like a man walked to judgment. The fluorescent lights inside the precinct buzzed overhead, sterile and sharp. The floor smelled faintly of bleach and cold metal. To his left, a teenager with swollen knuckles sat weeping. To his right, a man muttered to himself, twitching, ignored by the officers. Clarence's cuffs were finally removed, but only to be replaced by instructions barked with no room for humanity. Shoes, belt. Watch. In the tray. He didn't argue, he just moved carefully, methodically as he always had, folded his belt, slipped off his shoes, his bare feet pressed against the cold tile as he was directed to stand against the wall. Face forward. No smiling. Click. The flash of the camera stung his eyes. Then came the fingerprinting ink across the lines of his fingers. Press roll. Press roll. He'd signed off on thousands of warrants in his career. Now he was being processed like a petty thief. As they scrubbed his fingers clean, one officer glanced down at the wallet they'd confiscated earlier. "Hey," he called across the room, holding up the black leather ID case like a joke. "Get a load of this." He flipped it open and read aloud with a smirk exaggerating every word: Clarence Whitaker, Chief Justice, Georgia Supreme Court. He snorted. "A black Supreme Court justice. Right, and I'm the Queen of England." The other officers chuckled. Only one didn't. A young woman. Officer Riley, her name tag read, paused as she reached for the chain of custody log. She didn't laugh. Her eyes moved slowly between the badge, the man, and the mocking laughter of her colleagues. Something about the stillness in Clarence's posture, the poise, the utter lack of fear, it didn't match what she'd seen from actual criminals. And more than that, something about that name. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Clarence, seated on the hard bench nearby, looked up calmly. "I'd like my phone call now," he said, voice even low. The officer who'd booked him, bald heavyset, glanced over with disinterest. "Not your turn. No explanation. No rights read. No lawyer offered. Just time. Endless quiet. Punishing time." The hours slipped past. No clocks in holding. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional barked order echoing down sterile halls. Clarence sat with his back straight, eyes forward. He didn't sleep. He didn't speak. His mind moved slowly through the events of the day, not with panic, but with precision. This wasn't just about him. He'd walked into courtrooms where black men had been told they were too angry, too combative, too soft-spoken, too unreliable to be believed. Now here he was, wearing a suit, carrying judicial credentials, speaking with calm logic, still disbelieved, still dehumanized, still processed like a common criminal. He thought of every young black man who had no badge, no title, no camera, recording from across the street, who didn't get to walk free after proving who they were, who never got believed in the first place. Clarence inhaled deeply. This wasn't just about reclaiming his name. It was about exposing the quiet violence woven into the system, the type that didn't shout, but whispered just loud enough to ruin lives. And when the time came, he would not shout either. He would use the very law they'd tried to twist against him, and they would listen, not because they wanted to, but because the world would force them to. It was nearly 11:30 p.m. when Lieutenant Ronson finally stepped into the dimly lit holding area, a manila folder tucked under one arm and tension in every line of his body. Clarence looked up, the calm in his eyes unchanged. He hadn't moved from the bench, hadn't asked for the time, hadn't raised his voice once. Ronson didn't address him immediately. He turned to Officer Riley, first, his voice low but sharp. "Who booked this man?" Riley hesitated. Sergeant McKee and Officer Burns. Ronson's jaw clenched. "Get them now." Riley took one more look at Clarence, this time with something closer to respect, and hurried off. Ronson approached slowly, then opened the folder and laid it on the small metal desk. Inside the printout of a background check, driver's license, state bar membership, judicial appointment records, news clippings, commendations, all bearing the same name, Clarence Whitaker, Chief Justice, Georgia Supreme Court. Ronson exhaled through his nose and finally met Clarence's eyes. He began, then stopped. There was no good place to start. "I've just reviewed your identification. There appears to have been a procedural oversight." Clarence didn't respond. Ronson cleared his throat, uncomfortable in the silence. "You're free to go. No apology. No explanation. Just silence." Clarence stood slowly, his movements precise. He retrieved his watch, his belt, his wallet. He slipped his shoes back on with care, like a man not in a rush, because dignity, he knew, moved at its own pace. But the hush was spreading, from the bullpen to the front desk. Murmurs trickled down the hallways. Names were exchanged in whispers. Faces turned away quickly when Clarence passed. Some officers stood still, suddenly quiet. Others picked up phones, voices, tight-coded. Something had shifted behind closed doors. Calls were being made. City attorneys, police union reps. A judge's name had entered their system not through ceremony but through the back door of a jail cell. And that was dangerous because this wasn't just a mistake. It was a liability. It was exposure. Upstairs behind a frosted glass door, one voice on a speakerphone said firmly, "Do not put anything in writing. Get him out quietly." Clarence was escorted to the exit by Lieutenant Ronson himself, who looked as though he wished he were anywhere else. The double doors opened to the empty parking lot outside, the cool night breeze brushing past like freedom's quiet reminder. Ronson paused at the threshold. "You can pick up your vehicle in the morning. It's being held for review, but it'll be released." Of course. Clarence didn't nod, didn't thank him. He simply turned eyes forward and walked out into the night. The lot was deserted. No apology followed him. No one asked if he needed a ride. No one dared meet his eyes now. Inside the station, panic hummed beneath the surface. They had profiled the wrong man, arrested the wrong man, humiliated the wrong man. And worse, he wasn't just a name with power. He was the system they thought they controlled, and he had seen them for exactly what they were. The question now wasn't what Clarence would do next. It was how far they would go to make sure no one ever heard about what they had done. By sunrise, the city was already holding its breath. No press release had gone out, no statements made, just a quiet storm brewing in back offices and legal departments across the county. The name Clarence Whitaker had been whispered enough times overnight to turn fear into protocol. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, Clarence sat in a glass-paneled conference room at police headquarters across from Police Chief Wallace Grant. Chief Grant was a tall, silver-haired man with a politician's handshake and a badge polished for television. Today there were no cameras. Just 2 cups of untouched coffee on the table between them, one black one with cream, both growing cold. Clarence sat in silence, his posture relaxed but deliberate. No notes, no legal pad, no lawyer. He didn't need one. Chief Grant cleared his throat, then leaned forward, fingers tented together like a man trying to convey sincerity. He didn't quite feel Justice Whitaker. "First, let me say I appreciate you agreeing to meet. What happened yesterday?" Clarence raised one hand, slow and steady. "You don't need to rehearse it." "I was there." Grant paused, nodded, tried to regroup. "We've reviewed the incident. It appears there were several lapses in protocol, miscommunication really, a vehicle matching a description, your lack of immediate recognition. It was a mistake. An honest one." Clarence looked at him not with anger but with something more difficult to confront, complete clarity. "Mistakes," he said quietly, "don't come with handcuffs, slammed doors, or laughter at a man's credentials." Grant shifted in his seat. "They didn't know who you were," he offered. Clarence leaned in slightly. His voice never rose. "And that's the problem. Silence," Clarence continued. "You're not apologizing because something unjust happened. You're apologizing because it happened to the wrong black man. One with a title. One with a seat on the Supreme Court." The words landed like weight dropped from a height not loud but impossible to ignore. Chief Grant blinked. "I want to assure you we'll handle this internally," Clarence interrupted again, his voice steady, low. "No, you won't. Not quietly. Not internally. This isn't just about me. This is about a culture that sees black skin and instinctively reaches for suspicion." Grant sighed. "What are you asking for?" Clarence stood. "I'm not here to ask." He walked to the window, looking out at the city. His city, the one he had served, ruled over in law, protected through his judgments. Now it looked different. Smaller, fragile. He turned back. "I'm giving you a choice. Own it publicly. Start reform where it hurts, or wait. Because this isn't over. Not for me, not for this city, and not for the men you call officers who think justice is something they get to interpret based on skin tone." Grant opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Clarence moved toward the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam anything. But the silence he left behind cut deeper than any outburst ever could, because everyone in that room knew. He wasn't threatening them. He was warning them. And the clock had just started ticking. Morning light spilled through the high-arched windows of the Georgia Supreme Court like a quiet blessing. Polished marble gleamed. Velvet drapes hung with reverence. A hush blanketed the chamber. The kind of silence not born from fear, but from awe. At precisely 8:57 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Clarence Whitaker stepped inside. He wore his black judicial robe crisp and flowing, his head held high, shoulders squared. No bruises showed from the night before, but the room could feel the gravity that clung to him. He didn't stride in like a man returning from humiliation. He moved like a man who had survived fire and now carried its silence with him. He took the center seat. Chief Justice Whitaker bailiffs straightened. Clerks stopped typing. Counsel on both sides rose to their feet. The courtroom, packed and live-streamed, held its breath as he adjusted his robe and reached for his gavel. He didn't speak yet, but across the city in a small police precinct, the morning television was on in the break room. The live-streamed court session played without commentary, just the solemn hum of judicial routine. Officer Jake Tolland, the young cop who had pulled Clarence over, stared at the screen in disbelief. His mouth hung slightly open. His half-eaten breakfast sandwich sagged in his hand. "Yo, is that?" he mumbled. Behind him, his partner, the older, heavier Sergeant McConnell, looked up. He went pale. "You're kidding me," McConnell whispered. There was no mistake. The man they had mocked, cuffed and tossed in the back of a squad car 36 hours earlier, was now sitting behind a mahogany bench flanked by the state seal and flanked by law clerks and legal minds who bowed when he entered. On screen, Clarence finally spoke. "We'll begin with docket number 19-112, Whitaker v. State Corrections Council. Proceed." His voice, calm, deep, precise, echoed through the marble. Every syllable carried weight. Every pause made room for justice. At home, across offices, and in cafes all over Atlanta, people watched, phones buzzed. Is this real? Wait, they arrested the Chief Justice. The headlines wrote themselves. Georgia. Chief Justice arrested without cause. Black jurist detained by local police. No charges. Filed systemic bias. Exposed in real time. Outside the courthouse, protesters began to gather. Not with fury, not yet, but with signs, voices, and the uneasy knowledge that if this could happen to Clarence Whitaker, it could happen to anyone. Inside the chamber, Clarence remained composed. His expression was unreadable, but the silence behind his eyes was louder than the gavel. Not a word was spoken about his arrest that morning. No press conference, no speech, just law, order, precision. He let the robe speak, let the courtroom's reverence contrast the street corner's suspicion. And as he listened to arguments flipping through briefs with methodical care, the city began to see what it had failed to recognize the night before. This man didn't just represent the law, he embodied it, and the ground beneath the system had begun to shift. The city braced itself for a lawsuit. Reporters waited. Editorials speculated. Civil rights attorneys offered representation before Clarence even left the bench that morning. It would have been a historic case. National headlines. Millions in damages. A public trial that put the police department on display. But Clarence Whitaker filed nothing. No complaint, no press statement, no courtroom drama. Instead, he walked into a closed-door meeting with the Judicial Ethics Committee the following afternoon and changed the conversation entirely. "We don't need retribution," he said, his voice calm and unshaken. "We need reform." The Chief Justice wasn't interested in money. He wasn't interested in punishment for its own sake. What he demanded was accountability rooted in systemic change. That week, Clarence called an emergency session with the State Judicial Oversight Commission. Under his leadership, the Supreme Court of Georgia quietly authorized a new initiative, an independent judicial review board, tasked specifically with investigating patterns of racial profiling within law enforcement. It would not be symbolic. It would have subpoena power, oversight authority, and direct reporting access to the governor's office and the state legislature. He did it without a press tour, without angry speeches. No camera crews followed him, no podiums with sound bites. He simply worked methodically, relentlessly. Inside the Atlanta Police Department, consequences began to ripple. The two officers involved, Sergeant McConnell and Officer Tolland, were suspended pending internal investigation. Their names weren't released to the public, but the silence surrounding their absence was deafening. Patrol schedules shifted. Mandatory retraining sessions were quietly implemented. Some officers grumbled. Others, for the first time, asked questions they hadn't dared to before. Behind the scenes, Clarence made another decision. He requested a full audit of traffic stops statewide, broken down by race, location, and outcome. He wanted the data, the truths, and he wasn't going to let anyone look away from it again. The media eventually caught wind of the shifts. By week's end, outlets like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and WABE began running stories. Georgia Chief Justice sparks police oversight review. Statewide audit on racial bias in policing underway. No lawsuit, but major shakeups following Whitaker incident. But Clarence gave no interviews. He didn't sit down with anchors, didn't speak on podcasts, didn't write op-eds. His silence became its own kind of power, unnerving, deliberate, sharp. Those who had laughed at his ID now watched their departments pulled under scrutiny. Those who had dismissed him as just another black man on the road now realized he had become the moral center of a storm they couldn't outrun. And for black communities across Georgia, from Savannah to Macon to Augusta, the message was clear. This wasn't just about Clarence. It was about every black man who'd been told to get out of the car, every woman who'd been asked to calm down as her rights were violated, every child who saw handcuffs before he saw justice. Clarence didn't need to sue. He didn't need to shout. He'd chosen a different kind of consequence, the kind that rewrote the system from the inside out, and that more than any verdict or headline was what made the state begin to change. Change didn't come with fanfare. There were no dramatic speeches, no parades, no victory banners waving over city halls. But it came quietly, like spring roots beneath thawed soil. Clarence Whitaker began, where all real change begins with people. He returned to Emory Law School, his alma mater, not as a guest lecturer or a celebrated figurehead, but as a recruiter. He wasn't looking for the highest GPAs or the loudest voices. He wanted something else: grit, empathy, vision. Young black law students who understood what it meant to be dismissed before speaking, to be doubted before being seen. Those were the ones he pulled in. Through a new judicial internship initiative, he opened the doors of Georgia's highest court to a generation long kept waiting in the halls. You don't have to raise your voice to raise a standard, he told them. Court policies began to shift, subtle at first. Intake procedures for civil rights violation cases were revised to flag racial bias patterns. A fast-track review system was implemented for claims involving officer misconduct. Clarence insisted on anonymous judicial review boards for certain police appeals, protecting both transparency and justice from backroom influence. The ripples reached back to the precincts. The Atlanta Police Department, once the scene of his public shaming, now had to submit monthly compliance reports to the very oversight body he had formed. Officers once trained to ignore judicial credentials had to complete continuing education modules on civil liberties and implicit bias. One afternoon in a review panel meeting, Clarence paused as he skimmed an application. The name caught his attention: Daniel McConnell. It was a standard application. Well-written, thoughtful, sincere. The young man was applying for the summer judicial internship program, citing a passion for legal ethics and systemic reform. Clarence blinked once, then again. The applicant was the son of Sergeant McConnell, the very officer who had mocked him, cuffed him, and tossed his bar card aside like a napkin. Clarence didn't say a word. He passed the application to the clerk and kept reading. He didn't hold it against the boy, in fact the opposite. When Daniel showed up for his interview 2 weeks later, Nervous, respectful, eager Clarence greeted him with a handshake, firm and steady. "Tell me," he said, "what justice means to you." The conversation lasted an hour, and by the end of it Clarence saw something not just in the young man's words but in his eyes, a quiet conflict, a hunger to do better, to be better. That summer Daniel interned under the man his father once tried to humiliate. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he moved, and he changed, not overnight, not entirely, but enough. So did others. One by one, the seeds Clarence planted began to grow. A clerk in Macon filed a complaint that sparked a precinct audit. A prosecutor in Savannah, once apathetic to misconduct claims, began offering mentorship to youth diverted from the system. A judge in Augusta rewrote her chamber's hearing protocols based on Clarence's reform model. None of it made the evening news. But Clarence didn't care about news. He cared about the future, and every day he walked into that marble courthouse through the same doors they'd once tried to slam on him. He knew justice, if nurtured with patience, would eventually find its way to bloom. Even in the soil they said was too dry to change, the auditorium hummed with anticipation. Rows of young graduates in black robes sat still, their tassels catching the soft overhead light, their faces a mix of pride and nerves. Family members filled every seat, some standing along the back wall, clutching phones, dabbing tears, whispering prayers. Today marked the first commencement of the Georgia Equal Justice Legal Institute, the very program Clarence Whitaker had helped build from scratch just 3 years prior. The keynote speaker needed no introduction. When Clarence took the stage, he didn't speak immediately. He stood at the podium, his robe still crisp, his posture regal yet humble. He scanned the room slowly, the hundreds of hopeful eyes staring back at him. Some of them had once been lost, some had once been dismissed. All were now ready. Then he spoke. Justice. Clarence began, voice smooth and deliberate, isn't loud. He let the words hang there unhurried. It doesn't always wear a badge or carry a gavel. It isn't always broadcast, and it doesn't always come with applause. He looked toward the front row. Daniel McConnell sat there, hands folded, eyes fixed. Justice is patient, Clarence continued. It listens. It endures. And when the noise fades, justice remembers. A silence filled the room, not from discomfort, but reverence. Clarence closed with no dramatic crescendo, just a simple line. It remembered me, and now it remembers you. As he stepped back from the podium, the audience stood as one, a standing ovation. But Clarence didn't raise his hands or nod in triumph. He simply offered a brief, grateful smile, then walked quietly off stage. Later the crowd poured into the campus quad, taking pictures, embracing, cheering. But Clarence slipped away. No entourage, no press. Just the man and the path he had walked for decades, paved with dignity, worn with trials. He made his way toward the parking lot, the same quiet street where it had all begun, same neighborhood, same car model, a modest silver sedan, spotless but unpretentious. As he opened the door, an officer on a nearby patrol bike caught his eye. A young Latina woman, probably no older than 24, nodded politely. "Evening, sir," she said with respect. Clarence nodded back. "Keep doing good work." She didn't question him, didn't stop him, just smiled and kept riding. Clarence slid into the driver's seat. For a moment he sat there, hands on the wheel, engine off, watching the sun dip behind the trees lining the boulevard. The world had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. The narration returns quiet, steady. They tried to erase his dignity. Instead, he rewrote their system. The camera pans up over the courthouse dome, lit by the last rays of day over the campus, where justice now had new stewards, and finally up into the sky, open, unclouded. Clarence's legacy wasn't in a plaque or a headline. It lived in people, in every intern who dared to speak, in every officer who chose to listen, in every courtroom that now paused before judging a man by his skin, and in that simple, quiet drive home undisturbed. Justice at last had room to breathe. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that speak truth to power. This story shows that unchecked prejudice leads to painful consequences, while quiet dignity and firm integrity bring true strength. It reminds us that systemic racism doesn't disappear just because someone holds a title or wears a robe. Such incidents still happen in courtrooms, on highways, and in neighborhoods across America, places where justice should never be questioned and yet often is. In our personal lives, we should listen more carefully, speak with respect, and never rush to judgment. In the workplace, we must challenge bias. advocate for fairness, and protect those who are unfairly targeted. As a community, we must hold systems accountable and lift up leaders who lead with courage, not ego. By practicing values like respect, humility, and truth, we build a more inclusive and just society, not just for some, but for all.